For in the one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. Please be seated. One of my favorite seminary professors was Eugene Sutton, formerly a canon at Washington National Cathedral, and now our neighboring bishop in the Diocese of Maryland. Father Sutton used to tell his students that as future Episcopal clergy, we would be asked to follow the Episcopal Lectionary, our church calendar, detailing which passages from Scripture will be read when throughout the year. And he told us that preaching from the lectionary would sometimes be challenging. That there'd be weeks when we'd look at certain readings assigned for a particular Sunday, and we'd wonder where the good news was and how on earth we were supposed to find it and share it. But he added that every now and then we'd be scheduled to preach on a day when one of our absolute all-time favorite passages from Scripture was on the calendar. Well, today is my lucky day. The passage that we heard this morning from 1 Corinthians, describing in detail the body of Christ and its myriad members, has always been a personal favorite. I loved it as a child in Sunday school at St. Albans Episcopal Church in Syracuse, New York. And decades later, I was thrilled in my Greek language class in seminary when I was finally able to translate it from the original into English, with lots of help from my trusty Greek-English dictionary and a very patient professor. And here it is today as one of our lectionary readings. So let's explore together this morning how God is speaking to us through this passage and what it might mean for St. Luke's. In today's epistle, St. Paul is writing to the fledgling church in Corinth. It is a congregation that he had founded several years earlier in the capital city of a Roman province in what is today modern Greece. Like Washington in the 21st century, Corinth in the 1st century was a large and prosperous urban center with an ethnically, culturally, and religiously diverse population. It was a city, a province, indeed a world, defined by class distinction and racism and nationalism and tribalism that tore at the fabric of societal unity. It was a world in which people prided themselves on their separation from others, on being somehow superior to someone else. So to your average first century Corinthian, unity came from exclusivity, not from diversity. In the portion of 1 Corinthians that forms today's epistle reading, St. Paul refers to some classic distinctions of his day: Jew and Greek, slave and free, man and woman. Into which category a person fell made a great deal of difference, legally, culturally, socially. And the congregation that Paul had founded and is now writing to in Corinth is a congregation that finds itself in conflict. Some of this conflict involves people who are interpreting the forgiveness of sin as an excuse for immorality. And some of it involves people who are claiming to have some sort of special knowledge of God, some kind of divine fast track to be superior to their fellow parishioners. But Paul's message to them 2 millennia ago is of unity through diversity, of everyone possessing unique spiritual gifts that are essential to building up the body of believers. Paul's message of reconciliation and unity for the greater good is a continuation of Jesus' radical hospitality and ministry of inclusion and his perennial message of love. Paul introduces and elaborates on the metaphor of the church as Christ's body. He uses the human body to illustrate his point that unity and diversity are not incompatible. In this passage, Paul stresses first the diversity and thus the interdependence of the body's many parts. All are necessary. None are excluded. Paul's implication is that in the body of Christ, all people with their very God-given spiritual gifts are equally valuable. Unfortunately, in our day, we remain torn by separations of race and ethnicity, of rich nations and poor nations, of Jew, Muslim, and Christian. In our own beloved Episcopal Church, we have traditionalists and modernists, right-oneers and right-toers, supporters and opponents of gay bishops and clergy, and same-gender marriage. And within the Anglican communion of which we are a part, there are strained relations and stresses over differences of theology, tradition, and social custom. So sometimes there seems to be no end to the divisions that separate us in so many ways. Yet we also see examples of unity with diversity in our troubled, often broken world. Examples that offer great hope and give us a glimpse of God's kingdom. Let us explore for a moment one of those glimpses of great hope, of God's kingdom being realized right here on this fragile earth, our island home. 9 years ago this month, a massive 7.0 earthquake rocked and shattered the Caribbean island nation of Haiti. Chaos and confusion reigned, particularly in the capital, Port-au-Prince, where loss of life and destruction were devastating. Search and rescue crews from around the world poured into Haiti and worked tirelessly in the days immediately following the quake, searching for survivors. They were on the verge of giving up, packing up their equipment and returning home, when exactly 11 days after the horrific earthquake, a 24-year-old young man named Wismond Exantus Jean-Pierre was rescued from the ruins of a hotel shop. Haitian, Greek, American, and French rescuers all worked together to free him from the rubble. Most of the rescue workers had years of training and were considered experts in search and rescue operations. But others who came to help and dig in the rubble were untrained. They were moved to help and did whatever they could. And this young man emerged with no visible major injuries. He was quickly taken to a hospital to be treated for severe dehydration. According to news reports, a rescuer with the French team called the 3-hour effort to free the young Haitian man a miracle. American and Greek workers were seen leaping with joy following successful effort. And when questioned by a reporter about how such a rescue was possible so long after the earthquake, the head of the French team pointed to the sky and said simply, "This is God." I would point not just to the sky and say simply, "This is God," but I'd also point to all of those involved in search and rescue efforts in Haiti and elsewhere. For the brave women and men who respond to such crises epitomize love. Sacrificial love, love for the other, love without barriers or boundaries. And one doesn't have to be an emergency responder to do this. There are plenty of opportunities for us, as Episcopalians, as Christians, as members of the body of Christ, to be Christ's hands and feet and heart in our communities, our city, our country, to reach out to others in love, both literally and figuratively. Wismond Exantus Jean-Pierre's dramatic rescue in Port-au-Prince almost a decade ago is an extreme example of how we are all called to work together in any way we can, using whatever gifts we have to offer as members of the body of Christ. We are the body of Christ, each of us with a different spiritual gift to give that sometimes isn't readily apparent to us and even to others. Each and every one of us has a gift to give, and we mustn't let anxiety, fear, modesty, or doubt stand in the way. It is essential that we remain open to God's ability to shape us in surprising and unexpected ways throughout our entire lives for the good of God's kingdom on earth. And as we acknowledge and freely offer our own God-given gifts, it is equally important that we look for, indeed seek out, affirm, and encourage the gifts of others. In last Sunday's epistle, which was also from Paul's letter to the Corinthians, we heard, and I quote, "There are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of services, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good." In other words, we all have something to offer. In today's reading, Paul reminds us that the members of the body that seem to be weaker are actually indispensable. And how true that is. Sometimes the most vulnerable members of a congregation are also its most vital ones. Indeed, the late Henry Nouwen, the Holland-born Roman Catholic priest, writer, and theologian, wrote in his seminal book entitled The Wounded Healer, and I quote, "Nobody escapes being wounded. We all are wounded people, whether physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually. The main question is not, how can we hide our wounds so we don't have to be embarrassed? But rather, how can we put our woundedness in the service of others? When our wounds cease to be a source of shame and become a source of healing, we have become wounded healers. now one continues on this topic. Jesus is God's wounded healer. Through his wounds we are healed. Jesus' suffering and death brought joy and life. His humiliation brought glory. His rejection brought a community of love. As followers of Jesus, we can also allow our wounds to bring healing to others. And the Apostle Paul conceives of a united, diverse Christian community in which everyone shares together in the sufferings as well as the joys, in which everyone is there for each other, no matter what. So yes, sometimes our most vulnerable members are our most vital. Now, I have been privileged to be associated with St. Luke since last July as what I like to call an itinerant minister and what is more commonly referred to as supplied clergy. And so this congregation's many gifts have become apparent to me. Some members offer their musical gifts. Others ensure that the altar, God's table, which is open to all, is reverently and beautifully prepared for all 3 Sunday services. Some are engaged in outreach to those who are homeless. And others support some of the most vulnerable children in our city through the Episcopal Center for Children on Nebraska Avenue in Northwest D.C. The list of these ministries goes on and on. And this congregation is blessed with a beautiful sacred space and a solid parish hall with what my beloved late grandmother used to refer to as good bones. And the front of the sanctuary here, out on 15th Street, has a verdant lawn on a major urban artery, perhaps with a bench, a small statue of St. Francis or some other religious figure, and a little low-cost landscaping. It could beckon passers-by to stop and rest for a while. St. Luke's is situated in a vibrant neighborhood in a dynamic city. And the possibilities are endless to build up the body of Christ right here and then share God's love through outreach to others. So the opportunities to share our God-given gifts with others are exciting. We are all part of Christ's body. We are all part of Christ's body, but we don't make the body of Christ. We don't do it on our own. God does. We don't provide the gifts which keep the body of Christ alive and functioning and doing God's work in the world. God does. We don't define who or what belongs in the body of Christ. God does. And God calls us to use all of the gifts of the body of Christ to do God's work in the world. We are all called to seek justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God, in God's body, doing our part, whatever that might be. Not as isolated individuals, not relying on our own inner strength, not with our own intellect, but together and united with shared wisdom. For as St. Paul so rightly tells us, here at St. Luke's, across the Episcopal Diocese of Washington and far beyond, we are all baptized into one body, and we are all made to drink of one Spirit. And when it all does come together, when we actually do get it right, when we set aside our differences and celebrate our diverse gifts, when we turn away from tension and instead embrace one another, then, like that rescue worker in Haiti, we will be able to say simply, "This is God." Amen.
Amen.